let's get started, okay? Let me pray for us and then we'll get going. Father, what a joy it is to be back together with these people to study your word and to, I guess, just to hear from you. I pray, Lord, that you will guard all that I say, make sure that all that I say and do this evening will be honoring to you and to your Son. And as we look at his life, and particularly in this passage tonight, as we see his heart and how he shares in the disappointments and the sorrows that we experience in our lives as well. So I thank you for this time in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, I just want to start. I guess I could tell you where we are. So does everybody sort of know where we are? We're in Mark chapter 8 at verse 14. We are still in the first half of the book of Mark. And back earlier in the book, when Jesus was in a boat, fell asleep, a storm came up. The disciples were afraid the boat was going to sink because the storm was so terrible. They wake him up and he calms the storm down. And then they look at each other and they say, "Who is this man?" We're still in that hunk. We're still in the part of the book where it's, who is this man? And so we're still going to be answering that question as we go along. And it will be a mantra of mine until we get to the breaking point where the book divides in half and we move to the second half. But I just want you to know that as we talk about everything, I'm going to keep coming back to this. And it's like, I had a moment this weekend when I was preaching where I said, well, in the first half of the book, we discover that Jesus is a man who, and I don't know how many of you heard me, but it was like, he has power over demons, he can multiply food, just the list went on and on and on. And then just to even do the preaching, I shortened that list just so I wouldn't waste a lot of time. We're going to find out tonight some other things about who this man is. But these are not going to be things that are miraculous or wondrous. These are going to connect his heart to ours. And what has just happened is that Jesus has fed 4,000 people, and the disciples gathered up the extras, and they crossed back across the lake, and when they landed, the Pharisees went after Jesus, and they wanted a sign. And them wanting a sign, remember, a sign was always something that showed that they had authority that came from outside of themselves. They wanted this kind of a sign. They wanted Jesus to do something miraculous in some manner that would remind them of the earlier prophets so they could connect him. And yet, here's the problem. We know that the Pharisees had no interest in anything that he would do. They would find a way to turn anything he did into something evil. They were not really wanting to say, "Oh my goodness, Jesus, what you've just done proves to me that we should follow you." They're not going to do that. And so Jesus is done with them. And I just want to read, if we start, I'll start at verse 12, and it says, when he heard this, he sighed deeply in his spirit. This is that they wanted a miraculous sign. He said, "Why do these people keep demanding a miraculous sign?" He's been showing plenty anyway. He says, "I tell you the truth, I will not give this generation any such sign." And I went into great detail in that on the last video that I did. And then it says, and so he got back into the boat and left them, and he crossed to the other side of the lake. And now we get to tonight's passage. He says he crossed to the other side of the lake. And the first word in verse 14 is actually "and," which is a common thing in Greek and Hebrew to begin every sentence as a connector with "and." And so what I think is unfortunate for us is that because the people who put these Bibles together, they divide them up into hunks. But this is actually a continuation on. They get into the boat. It says they get into the boat, crossed to the other side of the lake, and then it goes, but the Pharisees had forgotten to bring any food. They only had one loaf of bread with them in the boat. Now, as they were crossing the lake, Jesus warned them, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. At this, they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. And Jesus knew what they were saying, so he said, why are you arguing about having no bread? Don't you know or understand even yet? Are your hearts too hard to take it in? You have eyes, can't you see? You have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember anything at all? When I fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up afterward? 12, they said. And when I fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves, how many large baskets of leftovers did you pick up? 7, they said. Don't you understand yet? He asked them. Okay, this is what we're just going to cover that tonight, okay? And I just have to say that we have come to a moment that is pregnant with, I would say, the frailties of human understanding. And then there is a deep sadness in this passage in Jesus, the sadness that he must have felt as he realized, now think about this, how little these men that he'd spent all this time had actually figured out about him. This small moment in this larger book, it has drawn tons and tons of critical analysis, if I can say it that way. And here's the thing, that there's a whole school that thinks that this is it's impossible for this thing to be true. They think that somebody just made this up because they had other spiritual or theological truths to tell us about. And I'll explain that in a minute. That there's no way that the disciples could be arguing about bread and then Jesus come up with this statement about yeast. It's almost like it's too good to be true that it worked that way. And so you'll read commentators go, and particularly if you read medieval commentators, they will go immediately to metaphorical things. In this little story, did you notice how much stuff is in the story? There are numbers of loaves of bread, numbers of baskets full, there's a boat, there's all this stuff, there's the 1 loaf of bread, and all this stuff. And so what they do is they take all these numbers and all this stuff, and then they make each one of them mean something. And they go off on this deeper theological thing that's happening here. This story didn't really happen. Mark had some other thing to teach us, and so they're trying to make those numbers. Are you following me what I'm saying here? And I just want to say this. I don't think that that's the case at all. I mean, I know that the numbers are 7, which we know is the number of God at work, the number of God. 12 is clearly the number for the nation of Israel. Get this. They say that they have 1 loaf in the boat because who's the bread of life? So this is a secret way to tell us that the bread of life is in the boat because they've got 1 loaf, which is and I read way too much of this. The reason I'm telling you about it is I read too much about it, so I just had to tell you, okay? I don't think there's anything particularly metaphorical about this story at all. I think this is an absolute event. First off, if you recall, the book of Mark is primarily the recollections of Peter. And I don't think Mark was in the business of making up stories. I also don't think that Peter was in the business of making up stories, that he was filling with numbers and things like this to say something that you have to really dig to figure out what he's talking about. I think Peter was too down to earth and practical, and the gospel itself is just too cut and dry for anything other than, you know what happened? They got in a boat And they realized what? It says they got in and it says they'd forgotten to bring any food. Now, I don't know who was responsible, and they weren't sure where they were going. The picture could be, Jesus said what? He'd multiplied food for 4,000 people, and they'd gathered up how many baskets full? Well, a lot. Maybe they still had some left over, and nobody thought of it. Or maybe they'd eaten it all, and that somebody was in charge of getting food. It says they only had one loaf of bread with them in the boat. This seems like a normal thing to me. They left quickly. Jesus was what? Upset. And they get in a boat and they take off, and whoever's responsibility it was to bring some food, because they don't know where they're going. And then they're going, oh no. Now, it is true that in the ancient world, it wasn't like you could just run into the get-go. Seriously, it was a thing. You'd have to find a place to buy food. It's not easy. But that they'd forgotten to bring any bread. This is a circumstance that they're all now worried about. They have one loaf of bread with them. Now, what are we supposed to think immediately at this point in the Gospel of Mark when we see that they're in a boat and they only have one loaf of bread? What has Jesus just done recently? He's taken 5 loaves, or I forget the exact number, 7, and fed 5,000 people. He's taken another number of loaves and he's fed how many people? 4,000. There are 13 of them in the boat, and he's got one loaf. I think his odds are pretty good. And yet, they're what? Upset with each other, we'll find. Now, boats are not that big. They were big enough to hold that many people. Some people say there's no way that Jesus would have had any way to know that they were talking about bread. There's no way that Jesus wouldn't have had any way to know they were talking about bread. The boats are too small. Even if they're whispering at the back of the boat and they're talking about it, there's no way that he could not have heard it. Now, it could go this way. They were whispering and fussing with each other like, oh no, what are we going to do? James, you were supposed to buy the bread, or isn't that Judas's responsibility to get the bread, or what, that kind of thing. I don't know what they were doing. I will say this. The idea when when they're crossing the lake, Jesus warns them. The 2 words in Greek, those 2 words, there they are right there. Watch out. Beware. And it rhymes in Greek. They're in the boat fussing, and all of a sudden he calls this out. Watch out. Beware. It probably caught them off guard. You know what I'm thinking? Jesus was still back on the shore, contemplating what had just happened to him with those Pharisees. He says, watch out and beware. And then he says this interesting thing. Of what? Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Now, in our Bible, it says he warned them. That is a terrible translation. I'm just going to put it out there. The word in the Greek means to command. It's only used 6 times in the whole of the New Testament, and it is a straight up one. He was charging them. He was giving it to them. You beware of. And the reason is because he wants them to stay away from something. And we're going to have to figure out what that is that he wants them to stay away from. I am confident that he uses the idea of yeast because that was a very, very common image in Jewish thinking. Now, it had 2 meanings. Yeast had 2 meanings. The first, could be something very tiny that you could put into something and work it a while, and it would spread throughout everything. And that can be good or bad. But the point is the yeast of the... Now, I will say this, scholars fuss and fuss about what the yeast of the Pharisees is. We'll talk about that in a minute. But remember, the fact is that it's something that's small that can then spread to the whole. That's one. And that can be good or bad. The other image that it's used for is to say that if you put yeast in something and do not bake it quickly, it will make everything rancid. It makes everything absolutely useless and rotten. And I read in a couple of sources that said they cannot find a single secular reference to the use of yeast as a metaphor for anything in the Greek world where it is not something terrible. Okay? So Jesus, and this is a common image. It's not something that comes out of nowhere. I think Jesus was just thinking about how terrible that interaction was with the Pharisees was. Maybe he heard them arguing over bread. But for him to say, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, leaven, or the leaven of Herod, that just makes sense to me, that he, in an emotional moment, he just goes, boom. Now let's talk a minute about what the yeast of the Pharisees might be. What would Jesus be thinking about? Well, I've come up with a couple of ideas. One would be self-righteousness. I think it's a really strong statement to say that the Pharisees themselves are self-righteous, that they're self-righteous, and their self-righteousness is going to, even if it starts out as small with them, if they are pushing being self-righteous, pretty soon everybody that they touch is going to be what? So thinking that they have a right to be self-righteous. And I'm just going to say this. Self-righteousness, which leads to great hubris, will make anybody and anything horrible. Horrible. That is the huge lesson I think that I've learned in my life, that just a little bit of self-righteousness at the top of something will make everything underneath it worse and worse and rancid. There is nothing worse than people who are condescending because they think that they're living in a way that's just superior to everybody else. And when they make the demand that you have to live up to my righteousness, then everybody else gets the idea that you're the person that I'm supposed to be like. And pretty soon everybody's like that. I don't even want to talk about examples. I've got plenty. But man, I can talk about one. You know, I grew up in the Grace Brethren tradition. Are there any Grace Brethren here? Yeah, somebody. Any of the really strong Grace Brethren? Mine was really strong Grace Brethren. And I think I've told you the story that my parents drove me from Indianapolis to Bloomington so I could see Old Yeller. Because Grace Brethren people were told they didn't go to movies. And so my parents wanted me to see Old Yeller. And so we drove to Bloomington to see it because my parents knew that if it got out that we'd been to a movie, there was a whole generation of people, my mom and dad's age and older, who would have condemned us straight to hell because we went to a movie. And I was about 6. And you know what the first thing I said when I busted into my grandma's house when we got to Fort Wayne the next night? It's like, Mom and Dad took me to Bloomington and we saw Old Yeller. And all I remember is being asked to go outside and play. My dad's not here. That's unusual. He's not here. He usually comes. We could ask him, how did that turn out for you, Dad? Self-righteousness. And here's the thing. I was in a family and a church, which is a big church in Fort Wayne, big family. And there are about 3 of us walking with the Lord now, of my generation. Why? Because of self-righteousness. It's made everything terrible. It just made everything terrible. Now, I don't know that was the thing. The yeast of the Pharisees could also have been, and more scholars agree with this than with self-righteousness. It could have been just pure power. Because if you get a tiny taste of power, you just want more and more and more. And the Pharisees, now I just want to be really careful. You've heard me say, if you've been in any of my classes before, not all the Pharisees were terrible. And they were actually highly respected by the Jewish people. They were the one religious group that people thought actually were working hard to do the right thing. But if you get a bit of power and it starts to grow in you and you get more and more, you want more and more, and it makes you what? Rancid. And man, any of you been following, I'm going to hate to drop this one, but have any of you been following the podcast on Mars Hill? The evolution of Mars Hill? The pastor, you know what I'm talking about? This is almost always the case in the church. That when a senior pastor gets a sense of power, and he just wants more and more, and he wants to control more and more, and pretty soon he just feels like well, we see it all the time. I get this terrible email every day. It's called Ministry Watch. Do any of you get Ministry Watch? Don't, because what it is, it's a list of all the pastors and the ministries and stuff that tank. This youth pastor going to jail for this, and this pastor caught in this thing. It's just like, and you know what's almost always the same thing? Power. And they think they can get away with it. How does this happen? Something makes people feel that they don't have to live by the same rules that everybody else does because they're held up and all this, and it overwhelms me, to be perfectly honest, how this is. And I'm too gossip. What is it? Not gossip, but what is it? What do you call those? Tabloid prone. This is my Christian tabloid that I get it almost every day. There's somebody somewhere going to jail, or somebody getting caught for some Ponzi scheme in the church. I mean, I can't even imagine it. And it's happening everywhere. And that's just because people get what? A little bit of something, and then it grows and it gets in the whole thing. Now, I can see why Jesus would want to warn the disciples about those 2 things. First off, hey, what are John and James going to come to Jesus and ask him? They're going to come and say, hey, can we sit at your right hand and your left hand when you become the king? This is called what? Searching for power. That's what that is. That's all that is. They wanted us, they didn't want to do that so they could, what would be the right way? They could be a governor on Jesus not making any bad decisions. They just wanted power and prestige, and there's nothing good can come from that. And the other thing is that Jesus didn't want them to fall into the same kinds of traps that the legalistic Pharisees had fallen into. There's some things that we don't do. There's some things that we just don't do. And there's some things that we do. But the fact that we don't do them, or that we do the right things, does not make us any more righteous in any manner. Because, guys, our righteousness is purely based on the gift of what Christ has done for us on the cross. We don't get any extra points just simply because we're obedient to what we think we're supposed to be obedient to. I can see why Jesus said to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Now, the yeast of Herod is different. And it catches us a bit off guard because, to be truthful, Herod hasn't really entered into this story except that we have that long passage where he put John the Baptist to death. And what we see of Herod in that, it shows him to be weak and easily manipulated, and he's easily concerned about what people will say to him about him in a social situation. I just went off, didn't I? Oh, that's weird. I'm uncertain exactly what the yeast is. It could be this, and this is germane to where we are. Every other time that we run into Herod, he is completely confused about who Jesus is. He thinks at one time that he's John the Baptist come back from the dead. Another time he thinks Jesus' only purpose is to steal his throne. Possibly the yeast of Herod is just not having a clear idea about who Jesus is, because that would make sense in the bigger picture of who is this man. And Herod is somebody who, just think about this for a minute. If you get in your soul just a little bit of wondering, is Jesus really honest about all this, or is he what he really wants us to take over Herod's throne? And you know how that would grow in you and change your attitude about Jesus? Anyway, they didn't have any idea what he was talking about. It's an okay translation. Actually, the word tends to mean that you have a reasoned or deliberated discussion. You're considering. Here's what I think happened, okay? This is Tim Ayers again. I think that when Peter told the story, remember, Peter's telling this story and Mark's keeping it. He goes, well, Jesus said this thing about the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. And then we're back in the back of the boat. We're all reasoning with each other about what happened about the bread. I think he did this kind of air quotes thing. I don't know that they did that in that time, but but the truth is, they were arguing. They were arguing. And they were arguing over what? What could they possibly be arguing about? Who was supposed to bring the bread? They're thinking they're all really in trouble with Jesus over the fact they won't have anything to eat when they land on the other shore. Now, again, this is Jesus. He's just done 2 massive miracles with bread, and they're fighting with each other about this. I cannot imagine. I can't imagine what that did to Jesus' heart. Let's think about it a minute. These are the closest people to him. He's in the boat with them, and they are at each other's throats because nobody brought bread. I've been thinking about this a ton, about how hard it would have been for him to hear this and realize that they had not paid any attention. Now, I can't look down on the disciples because I can't tell you how many times I've heard the same thing over and over and over and over, and then I go out and do exactly the opposite. Or I think differently about it than I should. But them arguing, they're in a boat, for heaven's sakes. Most of those boats weren't any longer than like 2 of these tables together. he could hear everything. And he says, why are you deliberating about having no bread? What he does here is he asks 3 rhetorical questions. And his point is to get them to finally think about something, to think about it, because they want to know who this man is, and they've not even picked up on the fact that they don't need to worry about whether or not they have food or not, because he can take care of them no matter what. No matter what. Jesus knew what they were saying. I just want to tell you this. I don't think that and I'm glad that probably the greatest Greek scholar of the last 200 years, Dr. Cranfield, agrees with me on this, that we should not assume that this is some sort of supernatural understanding on Jesus' part. It's not some sort of intuitive, special thing that he knows. I think it's just because they were in a boat and they could hear everybody. He knew what they were saying. Or he could see them, and he'd heard the earlier fussing. And so he says to them it actually says, and he said to them, knowing he said to them is what it says in the Greek. But he asks these 3 rhetorical questions, which is better than what, after his awareness of what was going on, I could imagine him going, are you yelling at them? Like, stop this! What's wrong with you? But he doesn't. He asks some rhetorical questions to get them thinking. Why are you arguing about having no bread? And he's not expecting an answer. He's not expecting them, for Peter to go, well, we're arguing because we all think, he's not expecting that at all. What he's wanting them to think about is bread broadly in the sense of how bread has just played a role in their lives. Okay? That Jesus has already shown that, yes, God made the world so that bread would multiply. That you plant the seeds and it grows, and then you go through a process and eventually you make bread. There's a multiplication of bread through wheat. But Jesus is able to speed that process up really fast. He can do that with fish, by the way, too. Fish multiply, by the way, and he can make them multiply right here. In fact, most of the water turns to wine. Did you know that water turns to wine through natural processes? But he can make that process happen like this if he wants to. Why? Because he made the processes and he knows how to manipulate them. Time is of no import to him. In this moment, he's like saying, didn't you guys catch that? Didn't you catch that? Now, his why are you arguing is a sad statement because he knows what? No, they didn't catch it. No, they didn't catch it. I don't know that I've ever had an experience where people just didn't get what I was trying to do at all. I've had people that were really confused about what I was trying to do, but it was like it wasn't something that I had pounded them with the same things over and over and done things and said things that clearly were leading to something, and they're all off on a different tangent. I can't imagine it. Now, the next one, he says, are your hearts too hard? No, I haven't done, I can go back, Jeff, yeah. Are your hearts too hard to take it in? Now we're into something that's really cutting. The hardening of a heart. We need to talk about this carefully because you've heard me say this if you were, I don't know how long has it been. I don't know if I've said it to you live or if I said it in one of the classes, but one of the greatest realizations for me was about things related to the Bible is that anytime they're talking about the heart, if it's actually saying the heart in the text, it's not talking about this emotional space, this warm emotional space like we do. They did not think of the heart as the location of emotion. They thought of your guts down here. This is where your emotions came from. Do you know what they thought your brain was? Mushy gray matter that had no purpose. Seriously. It's like when you slice somebody's head open, this stuff unrelated to the rest of your body came out. We've found that to be wrong, but they thought that your heart was the center of your reasoning. Anytime we start talking in Scripture where the word in the text is actually heart, we are not in an emotional moment. We're talking about is your reasoning, your space that gives you, when you look at what's going on and you come to conclusions about what the truth is that part of you hard? That makes perfect sense in this moment, because what has Jesus been giving them over and over and over? It is objective truth about what he can do and who he is and what's important to him. And they should have been able to figure out just through their reasoning process that they're not dealing with somebody who's stuck if he only has one loaf of bread for 13 people. Does this make sense? Does it make sense? And so when he says your heart is hardened, we have to go back to where's the first place? Can you guys remember the first place in the Bible where somebody's heart gets hardened? And that's Pharaoh. And what's Pharaoh's problem that his heart is hard? It's that he refuses to believe the truth when confronted with absolute objective evidence. Moses says this is going to happen. Our God is going to do this, and it happens, and Pharaoh refuses to accept the fact that the God of Israel can do these things, and he's doing them to them because he has a purpose in it, and that's to get his people out of slavery. And his heart is hardened because he refuses to accept that. And what happens when someone's heart is hardened is that God stops trying to change their minds, as we would say. He stops trying to change their hearts, as they would say. Does this make sense? Now, I know it's like a weird language thing, because it's almost impossible for me to talk about my heart being the center of my rational thinking. But it was impossible for them to not think about it that way. And so he says, have you hardened your hearts too much to take in what I'm saying? In other words, have you come to hard decisions about who I am that make it impossible for you to change what you're thinking about who I am, because you've already made up your mind? Does this make sense? And he's throwing them in with Pharaoh, and he's throwing them in with what happens to the Jews in the wilderness. Anytime that there's a statement about when it says that God hardened their hearts, it does not mean that God made it so they couldn't make up their mind. It means he stopped working to change their mind. This is not what Jesus does here. He just says, have you got such hard hearts now that you can't take in everything's happening? Now, this would be cutting to them, because it's almost the same as like saying you're a Benedict Arnold. You guys get that immediately? If I called you a Benedict Arnold, you'd be offended by that, would you not? I mean, I think we're all in this room old enough to know who Benedict Arnold is. I mean, I don't know that they teach Benedict Arnold anymore, but that, if you know what I'm saying, he's a traitor. To say someone's hearts are hardened is the same kind of thing in their world, because their prime example of a hardened heart is Pharaoh. And the last person they want to be compared to is Pharaoh. But the last thing that Jesus wants to have to admit to himself is that after all this time, they have all come to conclusions about who he is that make it impossible for them to do anything but think he is what? Petty. He's petty because he's going to be mad at us because we don't have any bread. Does that make sense? Now he's quoting, I want to get the exact scripture. Make this announcement to Israel. Say this to Judah. Listen, you foolish and senseless people with eyes that do not see and ears that do not hear. Have you no respect for me? Why don't you tremble in my presence? I, the Lord, define the ocean's sandy shoreline as an everlasting boundary that waters cannot cross. The waves may toss and roar, but they can never pass the boundaries I set. But my people have stubborn and rebellious hearts. They've turned away and abandoned me. They do not say from the heart, let us live in awe of the Lord our God, for he gives us rain each spring and fall, assuring us of a harvest when the time is right. Your wickedness has deprived you of all these wonderful blessings, and your sin has robbed you of all these good things. Jesus is quoting out of that passage. And I've got in my notes that there are some really strong connections between the fact that they don't show Jesus respect. They don't recognize, he's not talking to the, he's not saying, haven't you seen that I control, well, wait a minute, he has controlled the water, has he not? And he's not talking, oh, wait a minute, he has controlled the blessings of food that comes in seasons. You see what I'm saying? There's a connection to what he's been doing to teach them who he is, and they have not paid any attention at all. And then he quotes right straight out of there, you have eyes, can't you see? You have ears, can't you hear? That's from Jeremiah. And that goes right back to him saying, don't you know by what I've done and said who I am? Don't you know yet? He says, don't you remember anything at all? I'm just saying, if I'd been walking with Jesus for 2.5 years, let's say 2.5 years, and I'd seen him raise the dead, and I'd seen him give sight to the blind, and I'd seen him walk on water, and I'd seen him multiply food, and all these things, I think I'd remember. But you know what? I'm no better than any of those guys. I probably would have forgotten and been nervous that Jesus was going to be mad at me because we couldn't make sandwiches later. Does this make sense? I can see why he's upset. Don't you remember anything at all? And then he asks them the question. Now this is cool because he says, when I fed 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread, how many baskets of leftover did you pick up afterwards? They say 12. He goes, okay. That's what happened with the 5,000. Then he goes on and he says, and when I fed the 4,000, they must have had another what? Gathering up at the end and said, how many people do you think were there that time, Jesus? He goes, I don't know. Was anybody trying to count? He says, it seems smaller. It's about what? 4,000. They come to a decision about 4,000. And then he said, and notice how it says large baskets? Because this is the word for the bigger baskets that they carried the big catches of fish in. 7. Now the numbers are important in some way. Yes, 12 does mean how many tribes of Israel there were. It stands for the tribes of Israel. And yes, there were 12 disciples. And yes, 7 is always the number of God at work finishing something important. He's at work in something and he's on his way to some place specific. And those numbers are everywhere. But I don't think that that's the most important thing here. The most important thing here is that they didn't remember that which had just happened so they could remember who Jesus is. And this is the saddest way this ends. Don't you understand yet? And we could ask the question, understand what? All kinds of things that they haven't figured out. But the one thing that they have not figured out is that Jesus is not somebody who's going to harp about something that's not important. He's going to focus on what is important. And what is important? He's telling us who he is. We don't get to decide what he's upset about. He's telling us who he is. Now, I find that really powerful. I also find it really sad. This is Jesus. Of course, there's like tons more details in the notes, but I wrote this down. I said, they didn't have the slightest idea who this man is, even though he'd shown them over and over and over. And so, watch this with me as we finish up. It's about time. I don't even know what time. We're about right. The very next story will be about Jesus healing a blind man. They're going to go to a place and Jesus will, and we'll talk about this next week. He's going to heal a blind man. In other words, he's going to see. Now, this is somewhat enacted, but it's also, enacted prophecy is where a prophet does some kind of thing that's that tells people, like, how who was it that had to lay on his side for a year and a half, and another guy had to walk around naked for like a year and all this stuff, and it's like letting people know something from God in their actions. But just chew on this for a minute, and we'll talk about it in depth next week. This next healing, the first thing that Jesus does, the guy can't see clearly. He can kind of see. And that's where the disciples are right now. They can kind of see. And then through the grace of God and Jesus coming back, he's going to do something else that's going to make it so he sees what? Perfectly clearly. And this is what's exactly mirroring what's going to happen now in the disciples' lives. Because really soon something's going to happen and they're going to see perfectly clearly who Jesus is. Because right now they have what? Clouded vision. Does that make sense? I think that stuff's cool. And I think that it gives me hope. I heard the most amazing interview on NPR last night where they were talking to Margaret Mead. I think it's Margaret Mead. Is Margaret Mead the person who lived with the chimps? No. Who lives with the chimps? Jane Goodall. Did any of you hear that interview last night? Something's happened to her. She's like this consummate, rational evolutionist. She's not she just was like evolution doesn't have anything to do with it. I take that back. She's a rationalist on all things that happen in the world. Everything is just stimulus response. Well, she's had a change. And she was talking about spiritual things in a way that were somewhat interesting to me. And they asked her what the next great adventure in her life would be. And she said something that threw me. She said, death. Because I'm going to get to find out finally, very clearly, exactly what is going on. And I started thinking about that, and I thought, that's not such a bad idea to think of death as the adventure that we get to go on to find out exactly what is going on, to see clearly, to understand, and to know fully, and to not be trapped in these broken, uncertain shells that we are in now, but to be freed. What an adventure. We don't think about death as an adventure, do we? But Jane Goodall called it that, and I thought, okay, sister, something's happening with you, because she was talking about it in the same way I might have talked about it if I were being interviewed. Now, I know that Jesus knew that there was no way that the disciples could figure out fully who he was on their own. But he gave them an awful lot of clues. And he was also a man, just like you, a person, just like us. And his heart gets to be broken when he takes on that mantle. And it's broken here. It's broken here. And that just makes me love him all the more. Because he understands my heart when it's broken. When people don't understand me and they think that I'm petty, or they think that I have interests other than what I'm saying I have. So, is that good? Yeah. Thank you. I'll have my sea legs next week. And we'll go into that next section, okay? Thank you so much, guys. I'm so thankful for you all. Thank you. We'll see you next week.